Power is often imagined as strongest when it is most unified. That concentration brings clarity, speed, and control. The paradox is that the Qing dynasty possessed unrivaled authority across a vast empire, yet that very breadth made decisive centralization harder, not easier. This essay is not about why Qing China failed to modernize or why it eventually collapsed. It is about how authority that had worked for centuries slowly lost the ability to bind itself together fast enough. What appears in retrospect as hesitation was experienced, at the time, as stability. What looks like delay was understood as balance. The stakes of this moment are not confined to one dynasty. They recur wherever power mistakes endurance for readiness and coherence for control. By the early 18th century, the Qing dynasty governed one of the largest and most diverse empires in the world. From Beijing, the imperial court presided over a population exceeding 300 million, spread across vast agricultural plains, frontier regions, and ethnically distinct territories. The emperor ruled through a centralized bureaucratic system rooted in Confucian governance. Civil officials were selected through examinations, provincial administrations reported upward through defined hierarchies, and imperial authority was symbolized through ritual, law, and precedent. The dynasty had consolidated control after conquering the Ming, suppressed major rebellions, and expanded territorial reach into Xinjiang, Tibet, and Mongolia. On paper, the empire was unified. In practice, it relied on layered delegation. The Qing court did not lack awareness of strain. Officials reported corruption, fiscal leakage, and local resistance. The imperial treasury depended heavily on land taxes that had been politically frozen for generations. Military forces were divided between the banner system, tied directly to Manchu identity and the throne, and the Green Standard Army, dispersed and locally embedded. Communication from the provinces to the capital took weeks or months. Yet none of this appeared immediately existential. The system had absorbed shocks before. Its legitimacy rested on continuity, not speed. That legitimacy shaped how information moved. Provincial officials learned quickly which problems demanded urgent reporting and which could be managed quietly. Bad news traveled upward, filtered through ritualized language and precedent. Success was framed in terms of maintaining order, not transforming institutions. The emperor sat at the apex of authority, but that apex depended on mediation. Centralization existed symbolically, but operational power remained dispersed across geography and custom. As the 18th century progressed, pressures accumulated unevenly. Population growth strained local administrations. Granary systems designed for smaller populations became harder to maintain. Fiscal extraction did not scale with demographic expansion. The court responded incrementally: new regulations, targeted inspections, rotating officials. These were adjustments, not restructurings. They preserved the form of centralized authority while deferring deeper consolidation. Each solution narrowed future options without appearing to do so. When external pressures intensified in the 19th century, the same patterns held. Western powers forced new forms of interaction: trade demands, diplomatic norms, military confrontation. The Qing court registered these events not as a signal that authority itself required reconfiguration, but as disruptions to be managed within existing frameworks. Officials debated how to respond without undermining imperial legitimacy. The question was never whether the center should transform itself, but how much change could occur without fracturing obedience. This produced a subtle distortion. Central authority still commanded loyalty, but its capacity to act decisively depended on cooperation from provincial elites who increasingly controlled resources, militias, and information. Rebellions such as the Taiping crisis exposed this gap. The court sanctioned regional armies to suppress the uprising, trading immediate survival for long-term decentralization. Power was preserved, but it flowed outward. The center survived by allowing autonomy it could not later reclaim quickly. The court understood this trade-off, but not as erosion. It appeared as pragmatism. Authority remained intact because it still authorized decisions, yet each authorization reinforced dependence on regional power holders. The empire functioned through negotiated obedience rather than direct command. Centralization became harder precisely because legitimacy required restraint. Attempts at reform followed this logic. The self-strengthening movement sought to adopt foreign technologies while preserving Confucian governance. Railways, arsenals, and schools were introduced unevenly, often under provincial control. The court endorsed modernization without monopolizing it. Centralization was discussed, but implementation lagged behind necessity. Reform became additive rather than integrative. By the late 19th century, the Qing state faced a dilemma it could not resolve quickly enough. To centralize more aggressively would require undermining the very elites and norms that sustained imperial legitimacy. To continue gradual adjustment meant falling behind, accelerating external and internal pressures. Authority hesitated not out of ignorance, but because its survival logic discouraged speed. Power that had learned to endure now needed to compress, and it could not do so without fracturing itself. This hesitation was reinforced by perception. The court still viewed itself as the rightful center of a moral and political order. Decline was interpreted as circumstantial, not structural. Losses were attributed to specific failures, corrupt officials, or foreign aggression, rather than to limits embedded in the architecture of authority. Centralization appeared possible in theory, dangerous in practice. Even as late reforms attempted to restructure administration, military command, and education, they arrived within a compressed window. The court moved faster than before, but not fast enough to outpace the consequences of earlier delays. Authority now issued commands that revealed its urgency, weakening the aura of inevitability that obedience depended on. Centralization efforts signaled strain rather than strength. The fracture was not a single moment. It was a gradual realization that the center could no longer act without permission from forces it had empowered. The Qing court still believed control was recoverable. New constitutions were drafted, councils formed, examinations abolished. Each action acknowledged necessity while exposing fragility. Authority was still present, but no longer unquestioned. What remained at the end was not collapse yet, but narrowing possibility. The dynasty existed inside a shrinking corridor of options. Centralization, once the source of stability, now required speed that legitimacy could not sustain. Power had outlived the conditions under which its architecture functioned smoothly. This story does not end with resolution. The Qing dynasty did not fail because it lacked intelligence, effort, or awareness. It faltered because authority that had mastered endurance could not relearn compression in time. Centralization was always possible in principle. In practice, it demanded sacrifices that power delayed making until delay itself became decisive. If this story gave you something to think about, consider subscribing to Timeless Questions. We explore history, philosophy, and the patterns that quietly guide human behavior.